Across the world, beneath jungles, plains, and windswept ruins, lie the remains of cities that were once thought to exist only in legend. For centuries, people dismissed them as stories, creations of poets and wandering monks, fables told to explain the rise and fall of kings. Yet as explorers pushed deeper into lost forests and archaeologists peeled back layers of earth, those fables began to take on the weight of stone, the shape of streets, and the breath of vanished empires. Angkor, Troy, Persepolis, names whispered in half-belief, suddenly stood before us, massive, undeniable, their towers and walls revealing how myth and reality are often the same tale told from different angles. The mystery is not only how these places were built, but why they were abandoned, how entire populations could vanish into silence, leaving monuments too large to ignore, yet histories too fragile to survive intact. In these ruins we confront questions about ourselves. How fragile is our own civilization? How easily can faith, war, or nature sweep away what seems eternal? Tonight, we travel through three of the most enigmatic lost cities on Earth, where stone remembers what words forgot. Welcome to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The story begins not in a classroom or an archive, but deep in a tangle of Cambodian jungle, where the air is thick with the smell of damp earth and the shrill chorus of insects fills every pause. It was 1860 when a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot hacked his way through vines and thorns in search of beetles and butterflies, his notebook filled with sketches of strange plants, when suddenly he stumbled into a clearing that seemed impossible. Rising before him was not a ruin of crumbling huts or forgotten stones, but an immense city of temples carved with astonishing precision, their towers climbing skyward like frozen lotus blossoms. For a moment, it must have seemed as though he had wandered into a dream. The jungle pressed close around the walls, roots clawing at sandstone blocks, but the scale was undeniable. He had found Angkor, a city so vast and strange that even in Europe, where tales of distant wonders had always been devoured, no one believed at first what he described. He wrote that these temples rivaled the works of Solomon, that they could stand beside the proudest monuments of Greece or Rome and not be diminished. To some, this was exaggeration born of fever, but those who came after him saw it was true. Angkor was not a single temple lost in the forest, but the heart of a kingdom that had once stretched across Southeast Asia, a kingdom whose people saw their rulers not only as kings, but as gods, builders of stone heavens on earth. As scholars later unraveled, this was the Khmer Empire, a civilization that flourished between the 9th and 15th centuries of our era. Imagine a capital where processions wound through miles of causeways, where shrines mirrored the sacred mountain of Meru, the home of the Hindu gods, and where vast moats were dug not only for defense, but as symbols of the cosmic ocean. Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument in the world, was only one piece of this immense puzzle. The French archaeologists who followed Mouhot's path discovered that these were not isolated shrines, but fragments of a metropolis the size of London, laid out with mathematical precision, stitched together by canals that gleamed under the sun. They found inscriptions cut into stone in both Khmer and Sanskrit, the ancient priestly language of India, revealing a culture that merged local traditions with imported spiritual visions. The words spoke of kings with titles like Universal Monarch and Lord of the World, rulers who built temples not only as tombs, but as statements of cosmic order, so that the land itself was bound to their authority. But Angkor was more than kings and gods. In 1296, a minor Chinese official named Zhou Daguan traveled to Cambodia on a diplomatic mission and stayed for nearly a year. His journal, written with the sharp eyes of a visitor both curious and judgmental, described a city of astonishing size. He noted markets filled with traders, the hum of women negotiating prices, the wealth of dancers and priests who lived in temple precincts, the lavishness of royal ceremonies, and the brutality of punishments that fell on those who disobeyed. He called the Khmer both ingenious and barbarian, reflecting the prejudices of his time, but his words have given us precious glimpses of a world otherwise drowned by silence. He recorded that crocodiles as long as boats swam in the rivers, that prawns grew as heavy as half a kilo each, that rice paddies stretched beyond sight, watered by a system of reservoirs so complex it seemed to bend nature to human will. He noted, too, that the king lived like a god among mortals, surrounded by wives and concubines, his power reinforced by myths that bound the provinces to him. For centuries after the empire's fall, the jungle concealed almost everything Zhou described. From the ground, Angkor looked like scattered ruins, but from the sky, another story emerged. In 1994, archaeologists persuaded NASA to turn its space shuttle's radar toward Cambodia. The technology, designed to penetrate vegetation, revealed ghostly outlines beneath the forest canopy. Roads, canals, reservoirs, and temple foundations stretching for miles. What Muhot suspected, what Zhou had hinted at, now became undeniable. Angkor was not a cluster of isolated temples, but a colossal urban machine. A metropolis perhaps home to nearly 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth in its time. How did they survive in such an unforgiving climate, where half the year is drowned by monsoon and the other half parched by drought? The answer lay in water. The Khmer engineered a vast hydraulic system, barrages, or reservoirs, each the size of a small lake, linked by canals that directed flow to fields and homes. Water from the Tonle Sap, the great lake that swells fourfold during rainy season, was captured and released with delicate precision. With this mastery, they fed a swelling population and transported the massive sandstone blocks that built their temples. It was a feat unmatched anywhere else in Southeast Asia, rivaling the aqueducts of Rome. Yet this brilliance contained its own weakness. Such a system demanded constant maintenance. A silted canal, a broken embankment, a political upheaval that delayed repairs. These could cascade into disaster. Walking among Angkor's stones today, one can still trace the fragility hidden beneath the grandeur. Carvings of celestial dancers, apsaras, smile from temple walls, their features worn by centuries of monsoon rain, while towering roots of strangler figs split stone apart. Historians debate why the city fell. Some point to Siamese armies that looted the capital in the 15th century, carrying off the king's harem as spoils. Others argue that the real enemy was within, that the belief binding peasants to labor for god-kings eroded after a ruler turned from Hinduism to Buddhism, replacing fearsome deities with a more compassionate creed. The jungle, once cleared for rice, may have reclaimed the land when fields were abandoned, choking canals with mud and leaves. Perhaps it was all of these together: war, ecology, faith, time. What remains certain is that Angkor, once a city of gods, was left to the silence of trees. When Muhat's pen first described its towers in Europe, people thought he had invented them. Now, each year, millions of travelers stand before Angkor Wat at sunrise, watching its reflection shimmer on the moat, hearing monks chant in a language older than nations, and wondering how such magnificence could have been forgotten. The stones do not answer. They simply endure, carrying the weight of a civilization that rose, believed, and vanished into shadow. If you close your eyes and try to imagine the rhythm of life in Angkor at its peak, you would not see only temples and kings, but hear the clatter of markets, the crackle of firecrackers at New Year festivals, the chants of monks echoing across courtyards, and the constant hum of a city that never seemed to sleep. The sheer scale of the population meant that thousands of families lived not in stone houses. Those were reserved for gods and rulers, but in wooden dwellings that time has erased. Archaeologists, guided by radar and excavation, have traced the grid of roads where ox carts once rolled, the footprints of homes raised on stilts above the damp earth, and the faint outlines of workshops where artisans shaped bronze, spun cloth, or carved ivory into offerings for shrines. To walk through Angkor then would have been to step into a vast organism where canals were its veins and temples its beating heart. At the center of this world stood Angkor Wat, conceived as a cosmic mountain. Its 5 towers mirrored Mount Meru, said in Hindu cosmology to be the axis of the universe where gods dwell. Its moat was not just defense, but symbol of the oceans surrounding creation. For the Khmer people, these were not metaphors but living truths. Every carving, every corridor lined with bas-reliefs showing battles, legends, and heavenly dancers was meant to reinforce the belief that the king was a bridge between the divine and the mortal. When Suryavarman II, known as the Sun King, died, his ashes were placed beneath the central tower, uniting ruler, temple, and cosmos in one eternal gesture. Pilgrims who entered its vast courtyards would have felt both dwarfed and reassured, reminded that their lives flowed in a pattern too great to see, but not too great to trust. Yet faith was not only displayed in monuments, it was woven into the routines of everyday life. Joe Dagwan wrote that Cambodian women were the engines of trade, spreading mats on the ground to display goods, fish, spices, honey, beeswax, woven silk. He marveled at their skill in bargaining, and he noticed how they held positions of authority unknown in his homeland. Women could own property, negotiate deals, and even serve as guards in the royal palace. Marriage itself was pragmatic, and Joe could not hide his fascination when he noted that Cambodian women, as he phrased it, were highly sexed and quick to take new husbands if old ones disappointed. Beneath his judgments lies a truth. This was a society where women carried power not only in private homes, but in the pulse of commerce. The economy of Angkor reached far beyond its borders. Chinese junks arrived across the Tonle Sap, bringing ceramics that archaeologists still unearth in fragments around the royal palace. Khmer craftsmen exported ivory, precious woods, bird feathers, and intricate bronze statues. A surplus of rice fed the city and became currency in exchange for goods from afar. Inscriptions carved into temple walls reveal the meticulous organization required. Thousands of villagers assigned to maintain a single temple, dancers and priests recruited from distant provinces, caravans of oxen carrying tribute from 3,000 villages to the capital. Angkor was not a static shrine. It was a living empire fueled by constant flows of goods, labor, and belief. But woven through the vibrancy was cruelty. Joe wrote of punishments so severe they shock even now. Thieves buried alive, lesser criminals mutilated, slaves captured from the hills, branded, and forced into service. One inscription tells of a man who tried to flee the land he had been bound to and was caught. His ears and eyes were cut away so that he might serve as a warning. The empire's greatness, like so many before and after, was built on both devotion and coercion. For the peasants who labored in rice fields or hauled stone blocks, the belief that their king was a god may have softened the burden, or at least made it bearable, but belief cannot mask pain forever. The turning of the seasons shaped everything. 8 months of searing heat left rivers dwindling to muddy threads. Then came monsoon rains that flooded fields and swelled the great lake fourfold. It was a cycle of feast and threat, one that demanded engineering genius. Within Angkor Thom, the royal city, archaeologists uncovered reservoirs hundreds of meters long, intersected by stone dikes that channeled water with precision. Gauges cut into sandstone allowed water to spill from higher to lower levels, keeping canals alive even when the rains failed. Yet this sophistication was fragile. Too much rain and the system clogged with silt. Too little maintenance and reservoirs collapsed. As one expert remarked, the very complexity that sustained Angkor might also have sealed its fate. By the late 13th century, cracks began to appear. Jayavarman VII, called the Builder King, had expanded the empire to its widest reach and filled it with monuments, hospitals, and roads, but his frenzy of construction drained resources. He was also the first Buddhist king, shifting the spiritual compass of the empire. For centuries, rulers had claimed to embody Hindu gods, demanding obedience as divine beings. Buddhism, with its gentler vision of compassion and impermanence, may have undercut that aura of fear and reverence. Out in the provinces, peasants might have started to question whether their sweat and blood truly served the will of heaven. When belief falters, even the most dazzling empire becomes brittle. The Siamese threat grew stronger. In 1431, their armies stormed Angkor, looting its palaces, carrying away treasure, dancers, even the king's harem. The capital was left vulnerable, its canals already silting, its fields already shrinking. The court moved east to Phnom Penh, closer to the Mekong's lifeline. Angkor remained, but as a husk. The jungle returned with relentless patience, roots splitting walls, vines covering towers, ponds filling with lotus and frogs. Monks lingered in small shrines, villagers fished in the moats. But the empire was gone. And yet, Angkor did not vanish completely. Legends whispered that the temples had built themselves, or that they had always existed, eternal and inexplicable. To local people, they were reminders that gods could walk the earth. To European eyes, centuries later, they were proof that Asia still held secrets as grand as Egypt or Rome. In the 20th century, restoration began, interrupted by the horror of the Khmer Rouge, who seeded the ground with landmines and made Angkor off-limits. Today, tourists arrive by the millions, tracing the same paths once walked by kings and envoys, though now with cameras instead of offerings. The paradox of Angkor is that it was both eternal and fragile, monumental and ephemeral. Its stones remain, but the society that carved them dissolved like mist. What destroyed it was not one blow, but a slow unraveling of faith, ecology, and power. And so Angkor stands as both marvel and warning, a city that rose as high as imagination allowed and fell as swiftly as memory forgets. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot wrote about Angkor in 1860, his journals caused an uproar in Europe. He had set out to collect beetles, but his description of colossal temples swallowed by jungle seemed more like the fantasy of a delirious adventurer than sober observation. Yet the sketches he sent back, lotus towers rising above tangled roots, corridors longer than cathedrals, walls carved with endless processions of warriors and dancers, were impossible to ignore. Newspapers published them with a mixture of wonder and doubt, asking how such a city could exist in Asia when European scholarship had never recorded it. It was as though a forgotten Rome had emerged from the forest, rewriting the geography of civilization. Soon, explorers and photographers followed Mouhot's path, their heavy cameras capturing glass plate images of temples half drowned in foliage, monks seated in meditation, while tree trunks thicker than columns wound across sanctuaries. These haunting images became part of Europe's imagination, proof that the world still held marvels untouched by modern eyes. By the end of the 19th century, France had transformed Cambodia into part of its colonial empire, and with conquest came archaeology. Teams of scholars and engineers set about mapping, measuring, and eventually restoring Angkor. They were astonished at the scale. One French scholar compared it to discovering Versailles, the Place de la Concorde, and the Louvre all within the same city, flanked by cathedrals equal to Notre Dame and Chartres. To Europeans, Angkor was not simply a discovery, but a revelation, a reminder that civilization was not the sole inheritance of the West. Yet restoration was slow and difficult. Stones lay scattered across fields like fallen chess pieces. Jungle roots had pried apart foundations, and whole walls tilted at precarious angles. Teams of Cambodian laborers sweated under the colonial sun, hauling blocks back into place, while French archaeologists carefully traced inscriptions, producing 7 volumes of translated text that for the first time revealed the names of Angkor's kings, queens, and priests. Bit by bit, a civilization silenced for centuries began to speak again. The 20th century brought both triumph and tragedy. By the 1960s, scholars believed they had rescued Angkor from ruin. Temples stood cleared of jungle, their corridors open, their towers rising clean against the sky. Archaeological journals published lavish studies, and tourists began to trickle in, marveling at this city of gods. Then Cambodia was caught in the storm of war. The Khmer Rouge seized power in the 1970s, and Angkor fell silent once more. Landmines were laid around the temples, cutting them off from the world. Scholars fled, and restoration stopped. For nearly 2 decades, Angkor remained a ghost city, its stones untouched but surrounded by terror. The contrast was brutal. Monuments built by kings who proclaimed themselves divine now stood in a country where human life was cheapened beyond measure. When stability finally returned, the world rushed back. UNESCO declared Angkor a World Heritage Site, and countries from Japan to India funded restoration projects. Archaeologists no longer focused only on temples, but also on the forgotten people who had made them possible. Excavations uncovered wooden post holes, pottery fragments, and rice husks that told of ordinary lives. Radar from the space shuttle had shown Angkor was a metropolis. Now the ground revealed the texture of that metropolis, from blackened hearths to bronze workshops. Scholars began to see Angkor not as a collection of isolated temples, but as a city where rulers, priests, traders, and farmers coexisted in a delicate balance. The temples, dazzling though they were, had been only the crown of an immense, complex society. Today, Angkor is no longer silent. At dawn, thousands of travelers gather at the moat of Angkor Wat, watching as the rising sun turns the towers crimson. Monks in saffron robes walk along the causeways, their chants mingling with the click of cameras. Guides tell stories of Jayavarman and Suryavarman, of Apsaras dancing to please the gods, of battles carved into walls that once taught entire generations their myths and duties. Children sell postcards by the gates, their voices repeating the same phrases Mohot must have heard from the villagers who guided him. Angkor has become a stage again, though its audience now comes from every corner of the globe. But beyond the spectacle lies a deeper resonance. Angkor speaks to us about the rise and fall of human ambition. Its stones remind us that civilizations can reach heights beyond imagination, building mountains of faith and rivers of stone, yet still collapse into silence when belief falters or nature rebels. For modern Cambodians, Angkor is both pride and caution. It is the symbol on their national flag, proof that their ancestors achieved wonders equal to any in the world. But it is also a reminder that glory can fade. The Khmer Empire that once ruled from Angkor fell not because it lacked genius, but because genius was not enough to withstand time, war, and change. As visitors walk among the ruins, they often ask why Angkor was forgotten. The answer is complicated. It was never truly forgotten. Monks kept its shrines alive, villagers told its stories, but it ceased to be the heart of power. Without kings, armies, and priests to maintain it, the city became irrelevant to history's loudest voices. Jungle silence filled the void. Only when foreign explorers arrived did the West declare it rediscovered. In truth, Angkor had always been there, waiting, enduring. Standing today in Angkor Thom, the great city, you can still sense that endurance. The Bayon Temple greets you with towers carved into giant faces, their smiles serene and ambiguous, as if amused at the folly of kings and empires. Roads once clogged with ox carts now lie empty under the tropical sun. Canals that once carried boats heavy with rice glimmer faintly in the grass. And yet, despite centuries of decay, the city feels alive. The stones do not whisper their secrets, but they stand, patient, waiting for us to remember what they meant. Angkor is a city of paradoxes, built to embody eternity, yet undone by time, raised to glorify gods, yet left vulnerable to human doubt. Its rediscovery reminds us that history is never truly lost, only hidden, waiting for eyes willing to see. And in that rediscovery, we learn something essential: that the stories we dismiss as myth often rest on stone foundations, and that the silence of the jungle can be louder than the words of any chronicler. To end the story of Angkor without standing inside it today would be to leave the tale unfinished. Walk beneath the galleries of Angkor Wat, and the walls unfold like endless storybooks. Carved figures march in processions of gods and demons, warriors on elephants, celestial dancers frozen in mid-motion. The reliefs stretch longer than any cathedrals, their details so fine you can still see the curve of a smile or the string of a bow after 8 centuries of monsoon rain. One panel shows the churning of the cosmic sea, gods and demons tugging on the body of a serpent to stir the waters of creation. It is not only myth, but metaphor. The Khmer believed their kings did the same, pulling the chaos of the world into order, drawing fertility from struggle, anchoring their people in the great cycle of life. Standing there, you feel the pulse of a society that saw no separation between heaven and earth, stone and spirit, past and present. Yet just outside the temple gates, the jungle reminds you how easily all that order unravels. Roots coil over fallen lintels, bats roost in dark chambers, dragonflies skim across stagnant ponds. The grandeur is undeniable, but so is the fragility. Scholars still debate which wound was mortal: foreign invasion, ecological collapse, shifting faith. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Empires die because all human creations, however mighty, are temporary. What survives are fragments, reminders, whispers. Angkor endured for 6 centuries as a capital, longer than many civilizations we call eternal. Its decline is not only tragedy but testimony, proof that even after abandonment, the stones still rise above the forest to tell us that once here, people dreamed on a scale as vast as the sky. When the French rebuilt walls and cleared routes, they did more than restore temples. They reintroduced Angkor to the world stage, ensuring that Cambodia's forgotten empire would never again be invisible. For modern Cambodians, Angkor has become both national symbol and spiritual anchor. Children grow up with its silhouette on their flag, monks chant within its sanctuaries, and historians remind visitors that these towers are not relics of a vanished people, but living heritage of those who still walk these lands. Every tourist who watches the sunrise mirrored in the moat participates, knowingly or not, in the same awe that first stirred Henri Mouhot, Zhou Daguan, and the kings who believed their monuments would last until the end of time. As we leave Angkor, we carry with us not only the memory of towers and carvings, but the questions they pose. How does a society create something so monumental and then vanish? How does faith build? And how does doubt dismantle? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many other cities described as myths in our stories might be waiting beneath soil, stone, or sea? The pattern repeats across the world. Legends dismissed as fantasy until someone cuts through jungle, or digs beneath a hill, or listens to the echo of an ancient poem, and finds that what we call myth is often history in disguise. One such story begins not in Asia's forests, but on a windswept hill in northwest Turkey. For centuries, poets sang of a city called Troy, where kings fought for a woman whose beauty was said to rival the goddesses. Its walls echoed with the clash of bronze, its fields saw heroes fall, and its gates opened to a wooden horse that carried deception inside. To most scholars, it was a tale, nothing more. A song recited in amphitheaters, a myth to teach about pride, fate, and the folly of war. But just as Angkor had waited beneath vines and roots, Troy, too, seemed to call from beneath the earth. The question was whether anyone would believe enough to dig. It was the 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann, a businessman obsessed with Homer's Iliad, set out to find the city others dismissed. He was not trained as a scholar, but he was fueled by conviction. In 1871, he began to dig into a mound known as Hisarlik, tearing great trenches through centuries of layered settlement. What he uncovered was not one city, but many, stacked like pages of a book, each older than the last. At first, he believed he had found Priam's treasure, gold jewelry gleaming as though fresh from the fire of Homer's verses. Later, scholars proved the treasure belonged to a civilization far earlier than the War of Legend, but the discovery had already ignited the imagination of the world. Suddenly, Troy was no longer a distant myth. It was a place with walls, gates, and the remains of lives lived thousands of years ago. Much like Angkor, Troy forces us to reckon with the blurred boundary between story and stone. The Iliad describes battles that may never have happened exactly as sung, yet beneath the soil of Hizarlik lie arrowheads, charred timbers, and human bones dating to around 1250 BCE, the very era tradition places the Trojan War. Archaeologists still argue, was there a single great conflict or a series of smaller ones stitched together by poets? Was Helen a real woman or a symbol of desire and fate? These questions may never be answered, but what matters is that the ground itself bears witness to fire and war. Myths preserve memory in song. Archaeology preserves it in dust. Together they give us a fuller story than either could alone. In moving from Angkor to Troy, we move from the tropical jungle to the Mediterranean sun, from a city whose kings were gods to a city whose fall was immortalized in poetry. But the thread connecting them is the same: the human impulse to create stories so grand they outlive the stones themselves. Angkor tells us of rulers who made themselves divine. Troy tells us of mortals who dared to fight as though they were gods. Both remind us that what we dismiss as legend often hides truths waiting to be unearthed. The story of Troy begins not with stone, but with words. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Greek audiences gathered in open-air theaters to hear the verses of Homer's Iliad. The poem spoke of a city by the sea, ruled by King Priam, whose walls were tall enough to withstand a decade of siege. It told of Paris, the prince who stole Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, from her Greek husband, and of the fleet that crossed the Aegean to take her back. For 10 long years the Greeks fought before Troy's gates, heroes falling on both sides, until cunning triumphed where brute force had failed. Disguised as a gift, a wooden horse was wheeled inside the walls, filled with hidden soldiers. That night, as the city slept, the Greeks emerged, opened the gates, and Troy burned. The tale is so vivid that for centuries listeners believed it, and so dramatic that skeptics dismissed it as pure invention. But the power of the Iliad lies not only in its verses, but in the question it leaves behind. Did such a city ever exist? For the ancients, Troy was more than a legend. To the Greeks, it was the place where their heroic age began, the crucible from which values of honor, glory, and fate were forged. To the Romans, it was their origin story, for they claimed descent from the Trojan prince Aeneas, who fled the burning city and eventually founded the line that led to Rome. Troy, whether real or not, was sacred ground. But by the Middle Ages, its location was forgotten. Maps placed it anywhere from Italy to Anatolia, or dismissed it as allegory. The city survived only in song and in the imaginations of poets. Then came Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman turned amateur archaeologist whose obsession with Homer bordered on madness. He taught himself Greek as a child so he could read the Iliad in its original tongue. He became rich in trade and used his fortune to pursue one goal: to prove that Homer's Troy was real. Scholars mocked him. They insisted the story was myth. But Schliemann believed that the poet's words, though embellished, preserved kernels of truth. Guided by the geography in the poem, mentions of rivers, plains, and a narrow strait, he turned his eyes to a mound in northwest Turkey known as Hizarlik. In 1871, spade in hand, he began to dig. What he found shocked the world. Layer upon layer of ancient settlement rose from the trench, each one the remains of a city built atop the ruins of another. At the bottom lay Troy Thorfomir, dating back to 3000 BCE. Above it were Troy II, III, IV, and so on, each representing centuries of habitation. The mound was not a single city, but a palimpsest of human life, spanning thousands of years. Schliemann's methods were crude. He hacked trenches with little regard for preserving context. But his discoveries were undeniable. Among the rubble of what he called Troy II, he uncovered a hoard of gold jewelry and weapons. Convinced this was the treasure of King Priam himself, he smuggled it out of Turkey, parading his wife in photographs wearing the ancient ornaments. Scholars later proved the treasure was far too old to belong to Priam, but the damage was done. Troy had been reborn in the public imagination. For the first time, people could look at stones and artifacts rather than verses. Walls still stood, staircases led nowhere. Shards of pottery told of meals long eaten. The Iliad might be myth, but it was myth rooted in a place. The world clamored to see Troy, and scholars, reluctantly at first, admitted that the story deserved a second look. As excavations continued under more careful hands, evidence emerged of a great city that flourished around 1250 BCE, the very period when tradition places the Trojan War. Burn layers of charcoal, scattered arrowheads, and skeletons suggested fire and battle. Still, the question remained: was this the war Homer sang of, or another forgotten conflict woven into legend centuries later? Skeptics argued that Homer's tale was a patchwork of many wars, not a single event. Others insisted the details mattered less than the fact that a real city stood where a mythical one was supposed to be. For ordinary people, the debate hardly mattered. The dream of Troy had leapt from page to soil, and that was miracle enough. Standing on Hizarlik today, you see a hill overlooking the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connects the Aegean to the Black Sea. The geography alone explains the city's importance. Control of Troy meant control of trade routes, of ships carrying grain, metals, and goods between continents. A city there would have been wealthy, powerful, and coveted, a perfect stage for conflict. Whether or not Helen ever walked its streets, men would have fought for Troy's harbor. Homer's story may be poetry, but the greed and ambition behind it are as real as stone. The allure of Troy is not simply that it existed, but that it bridges the space between myth and history. In Angkor, legends of temples building themselves gave way to radar maps of vast cities. In Troy, verses of gods and heroes give way to trenches filled with ruins. In both, we see how human memory survives in the strangest ways, sometimes carved in stone, sometimes sung in verse, always waiting for someone to listen closely enough to believe. As archaeologists sifted through Troy's layers, they found not only weapons and walls, but glimpses of ordinary life: grinding stones, hearths, loom weights, fragments of ceramic painted with patterns once held dear by families now long gone. These humble relics remind us that behind every epic lies a multitude of small lives, each woven into the fate of a city. Priam, Paris, Achilles. These names endure, but they stood on the shoulders of bakers, shepherds, and potters who never knew their home would one day be immortalized in song. Troy, like Angkor, became more than ruins. It became a mirror. For those who looked, it reflected the persistence of human ambition, the longing to believe that our stories matter enough to leave traces beyond memory. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of Homer's poem. Not whether the war happened exactly as told, but that the memory of struggle and desire can last for millennia, until one day a man with a spade and a stubborn dream uncovers the bones of legend. The hill of Hizarlik became a stage where generations of archaeologists played out their own dramas, each layer of earth holding secrets that demanded patience rather than haste. After Schliemann's crude but sensational discoveries, scholars returned with sharper tools and steadier methods. They realized that Troy was not one city, but many, each built upon the ruins of the last. 9 major layers rose in sequence, stretching from the early Bronze Age to Roman times. The challenge was to determine which of these could be the Troy of Homer's epic, the city that saw fire and ruin in the Age of Heroes. Attention soon turned to what is now called Troy VI and Troy VII, dating to around 1700 to 1200 BCE. These layers revealed fortifications unlike anything previously imagined. Massive stone walls, some rising 25 feet high, encircled the settlement, their towers jutting outward at angles that would have made attackers think twice before approaching. The masonry was masterful. Stones cut without iron tools but fitted so closely that centuries of weather had not shaken them apart. Engineers noted how blocks were angled inward, a technique that would have given the walls resilience against earthquakes common in the region. It was the work of builders who understood not only defense, but nature itself. Inside those walls, excavators uncovered the footprints of multi-story houses, storerooms stacked with jars, and courtyards paved with stone. Pottery shards revealed trade connections stretching across the Aegean and into Anatolia, suggesting a city plugged into a vibrant network of exchange. This was not a backwater settlement inflated by legend, but a thriving hub positioned at a crossroads of empires. Control of Troy meant control of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that carried ships from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Whoever ruled this city commanded not only trade, but influence across 2 continents. Suddenly, the motives for a decade-long war seemed less like myth and more like inevitability. Evidence of destruction was everywhere. Charred remains of wooden beams lay across collapsed walls. Arrowheads of bronze were found embedded in the rubble. Human skeletons, hastily buried, bore marks of violence. Most striking was a layer of ash that stretched across the site, a silent testament to fire sweeping through the city. Radiocarbon dating placed this destruction around 1250 BCE, exactly the period tradition assigned to the Trojan War. Scholars debated endlessly. Was this Homer's Troy? Could these ruins be the very ones where Achilles fought Hector, where Helen gazed from the walls, where the wooden horse rolled to its infamous rest? Skeptics cautioned restraint. They argued that wars were frequent in the Bronze Age, and fire could have consumed the city many times. The Iliad, composed centuries later, may have blended memories of several conflicts into one poetic epic. But even the skeptics admitted that the evidence matched the broad outlines of Homer's tale. A wealthy city, strategically vital, destroyed in war at the right time. Whether or not the names were real, the story of Troy was rooted in soil and ash. As technology advanced, archaeologists added new tools to the search. Magnetic prospecting revealed outlines of streets and buildings hidden beneath layers of earth. Soil cores drilled into the plain showed that 3,000 years ago, the sea had reached much closer to Hisarlik, forming a lagoon where ships could anchor. What seemed inland today had once been a bustling port, exactly as Homer described. Even the landscape began to align with the poem. Inscriptions from the Hittites, the powerful empire to the east, mentioned a kingdom called Wilusa, strikingly similar to Ilios, the Greek name for Troy. A treaty dating to the late 13th century BCE listed the gods of Wilusa, including one described as the divine earth road, a subterranean stream. Beneath Hisarlik, archaeologists found caves and tunnels channeling water through limestone. Here, at last, was a physical feature tying Homer's verses to Hittite records and the stones of Troy itself. The combination was electrifying. Myth, archaeology, and ancient diplomacy converged on the same hill. Scholars could no longer dismiss the possibility that Troy had truly existed, even if Homer's details were embroidered with the thread of imagination. Like Angkor in the jungles of Cambodia, Troy in the plains of Turkey was proof that stories dismissed as legend often concealed cores of truth, waiting centuries to be uncovered. Yet Troy was more than walls and ashes. Excavations revealed the lives of ordinary people, loom weights where women once wove cloth, grinding stones worn smooth by daily bread, bones of animals eaten in hurried meals. These fragments speak louder than any heroic verse, reminding us that while poets celebrated kings and warriors, it was common people who endured the siege, who starved when trade was cut off, who died nameless in the shadows of burning walls. Their voices are absent from Homer, but their presence is etched into the ground. By the Roman era, the city had risen again as Ilium, a place of pilgrimage for emperors who claimed descent from Trojan blood. Alexander the Great visited the site to honor Achilles. Julius Caesar traced his lineage to Aeneas. For centuries, Troy was less a city than a shrine to memory, kept alive because its story gave meaning to nations. Pilgrims walked its ruins not to study history, but to touch myth, to feel themselves part of an epic older than their empires. In this, Troy transcended even its stones. It became an idea, a reminder that human ambition, love, and folly could echo across millennia. Today, the hill of Hisarlik may look unimpressive, a mound dotted with scattered walls and the outlines of gates. But to stand there is to feel layers of time pressing beneath your feet. Each stone whispers of a people who believed their city would last forever, only to see it reduced to ash and song. Each trench dug by archaeologists bridges the gulf between story and soil, between Homer's verses and the stubborn evidence of fire, blood, and stone. As Angkor taught us, civilizations rise when faith, power, and nature align, and fall when that balance cracks. Troy's story is the same, though preserved not in carvings or radar maps, but in poetry and ash. Whether the war was fought for Helen, for honor, or for control of the strait, its echo endures because people need it to endure. In Troy, we see not only a lost city, but a mirror of our own desire to turn memory into myth, and myth into proof. When the smoke of Troy's destruction had long since drifted away, its memory refused to die. For the Greeks who inherited Homer's verses, Troy was not only the site of a war, but the birthplace of their heroic age. It was where men became larger than life, where the ideals of honor and fate were tested, and where the gods themselves meddled in human affairs. To recite the Iliad was to remind audiences of the values that defined them: courage before death, loyalty to kin, glory achieved even at the cost of life. The walls of Troy might have crumbled, but in the Greek imagination they remained tall, casting shadows across centuries. Philosophers and dramatists returned to its stories again and again. Aeschylus wrote of the house of Atreus, cursed by the decisions made before and after the war. Euripides gave voice to the Trojan women, lamenting the brutality of conquest and the fates of those left behind when heroes sought glory. For them, Troy was not only legend but mirror, a stage on which the deepest struggles of human nature were played out. In the flickering torchlight of Greek theaters, audiences wept not for Helen or Hector as individuals, but for the recognition that war spares no one, not even the innocent. For the Romans, Troy carried a different weight. They believed their own origins flowed directly from its ashes. According to Virgil's Aeneid, the Trojan prince Aeneas escaped the burning city, carrying his aged father on his shoulders and leading his son by the hand. After long wanderings, he reached Italy, where his descendants would eventually found Rome. By linking their birth to Troy, the Romans gave themselves a lineage older and nobler than Greece, one sanctified by suffering and perseverance. Julius Caesar traced his family line back to Aeneas, and Augustus, Rome's first emperor, used the myth to legitimize his reign. Troy, though destroyed, lived on as the fountainhead of empire. Pilgrims and conquerors alike traveled to the site in later centuries. Alexander the Great, before launching his campaign into Asia, paused at Troy to honor Achilles, laying wreaths upon his supposed tomb. He was said to envy Achilles for having Homer to immortalize him. For Alexander, the hero was less a figure of the past than a companion in destiny. Roman generals later did the same, walking among the ruins with reverence, seeing in Troy not rubble, but sacred ground. Even when the city rose again as Ilium under Roman rule, it was less a place to live than a place to remember. Its temples and theaters were built not only for citizens, but for pilgrims seeking to touch the echo of myth. By late antiquity, Troy had become a universal reference point. Christian writers debated its meaning, some dismissing it as pagan fable, others interpreting it as a lesson in the vanity of human pride. Medieval poets in Europe wove its story into romances of knights and ladies. The fall of Troy was retold in French, German, and English verse, reshaped for new audiences who barely knew the geography but felt the power of the tale. In these retellings, Helen became both sinner and victim, Paris a cautionary example of desire unchecked, and the wooden horse a symbol of deceit that outlives armies. The persistence of Troy shows how myth often matters more than fact. The Greeks may have sought proof of honor, the Romans proof of ancestry, the medieval world proof of moral lessons. Each era found in Troy what it needed most. In this sense, the city never truly died. It lived as an idea, flexible and enduring, layered like the mound of Hissarlik itself. Just as archaeologists peel back levels of earth to find older cities beneath, so too does each retelling strip away one meaning to reveal another. Troy was always more than place. It was story, and stories do not crumble like stone. And yet, the stone still mattered. Archaeologists in the modern era found themselves torn between myth and masonry, trying to reconcile what was sung with what was unearthed. For centuries, people had stood on Hisarlik and wondered whether the ground beneath their feet was the same trodden by Hector's sandals or Priam's tears. When Schliemann trenches confirmed that cities had stood there for millennia, the legend of Troy gained substance. No longer could skeptics claim it was entirely invention. The soil bore witness to fires, walls, and lives that had indeed risen and fallen. Whether or not Helen ever gazed from the walls, someone did. Whether or not Achilles killed Hector before the gates, warriors certainly clashed there. In this, Troy resembles Angkor in spirit. Both stand at the edge of belief, places dismissed as fable until Spade and Satellite proved otherwise. Both remind us that memory is never entirely false. It lingers, distorted, but anchored in something real. The ruins of Angkor whisper of god-kings and forgotten engineers, while the ruins of Troy whisper of poets and forgotten soldiers. In both, we hear humanity's longing to preserve itself, to refuse oblivion by building stories as strong as stone. To walk among Troy's ruins today is to see more absence than presence. The mighty walls are reduced to low stretches of stone. Foundations of houses hint at lives long gone, and the gates where Achilles was said to drag Hector's body are little more than outlines. And yet, in that absence, imagination flourishes. Visitors look at those stones and see not rubble, but epics, not emptiness, but echoes. They hear the clash of bronze on shields, the cries of women from towers, the fire-consuming roofs. In this way, Troy remains alive, not as a city, but as a theater of the mind, where every traveler becomes audience to a performance staged 3,000 years ago and never allowed to end. The transition from Angkor to Troy teaches us something profound, that civilizations die in many ways. Some, like Angkor, are swallowed by nature until rediscovered by science. Others, like Troy, burn in war, yet survive forever in poetry. Both tell us that memory is not passive. It chooses what to preserve. Stones may lie buried, but stories keep them breathing until we are ready to uncover them. And as we prepare to leave Troy, another city waits, one whose name still carries the weight of empire and fire, a city not sung by poets, but recorded by conquerors, Persepolis. Leaving Troy behind, we carry with us the lesson that memory can be stronger than stone. But as we turn eastward, across deserts and mountains, another city rises from history, one that did not depend on poetry to be remembered, for its ruins stand vast and undeniable even after millennia. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, needs no Homer to give it grandeur. Its columns still thrust skyward, its staircases still march upward in perfect symmetry. Its reliefs still show ambassadors bringing tribute to the King of Kings. If Troy was born of myth and Angkor of jungle silence, Persepolis was born of empire, designed to proclaim power so absolute that no subject could mistake it. Imagine approaching it in its prime, sometime around 500 BCE. The plateau of Marv Dasht stretches wide and dry, the Zagros Mountains looming purple in the distance. Suddenly, the earth itself seems to rise, for the Persians built Persepolis on a massive artificial terrace cut into the rock, an elevated stage above the plain. From miles away, travelers would see the gleam of limestone, stairways as broad as rivers, and columns higher than trees. To climb those stairs was to ascend not just physically, but socially, to leave the dust of the world behind and enter the domain of kings who styled themselves as Shahanshah, lords of all lords. The founder was Darius I, called Darius the Great, who ruled from 522 to 486 BCE. He was not only a conqueror, but an administrator, shaping the Persian Empire into the largest the world had yet known. His realm stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, from Egypt to Central Asia, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and gods. Governing such vastness required more than armies. It required spectacle. Persepolis was that spectacle. It was not built as a city of everyday life, for no markets or crowded neighborhoods existed there. Instead, it was a ceremonial heart, a stage where the empire performed itself for the world to see. Every spring, at the festival of Nowruz, delegations from across the empire arrived. Caravans of Lydians, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, and Scythians climbed the monumental stairways, each group dressed in its own costume, carrying gifts that proclaimed both loyalty and abundance. One brought fine horses, another ivory, another gold vessels, another textiles dyed with rare colors. These processions are immortalized in the stone reliefs that still line the staircases and palaces, rows of figures carved with astonishing delicacy, each bearing tribute, each led by a Persian guard. To walk past them today is to walk in the footsteps of ancient subjects, to feel the silent continuation of ceremonies that once dazzled with sound and color. Inside the great audience hall, the Apadana, stood 72 columns, each nearly 20 meters tall, topped with double-headed bulls, lions, or griffins. The ceiling, now gone, would have shimmered with painted wood beams, gilded in places, stretching wide enough to hold thousands of guests. When Darius or his son Xerxes sat upon the throne, the sheer scale of the space reduced even the proudest envoys to awe. The architecture was no accident. Every line, every staircase, every hall was designed to magnify the king and to remind all who entered that they were part of an empire unlike any other. Yet Persepolis was not only propaganda, it was also synthesis. Its builders drew from Mesopotamian traditions, Elamite artistry, and even Greek influence, blending styles into something distinctly Persian. The reliefs show not slaves, but willing envoys, suggesting that the empire's strength lay not merely in conquest but in cooperation. Darius himself carved inscriptions boasting not only of victories, but of laws, of fairness, of the god Ahura Mazda's blessing upon a ruler who brought order to chaos. Whether or not reality matched rhetoric, Persepolis embodied the ideal. A world united beneath a just monarch, diverse yet harmonious, bound together by ritual more powerful than any sword. But to look closer is to see tension beneath harmony. The same reliefs that show orderly tribute also remind us of hierarchy so rigid it could not bend. The king sits serene while others kneel. The stairways climb upward, but never sideways. All paths lead only to the throne. The very permanence of the stone suggests the fragility of the idea, as though the Persians knew that memory must be carved hard if it is to withstand time. And indeed, time would not be gentle with Persepolis. Centuries later, in 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon stormed into Persia. Victorious after battles at Issus and Gaugamela, he marched to Persepolis and gazed upon its palaces. Ancient writers say he was struck by its magnificence, but also by the memory of Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Some accounts claim that in revenge for Athens burned a century earlier, Alexander allowed Persepolis to be looted and set aflame. Others suggest the fire began during a drunken revel, an accident of torch and wine. Whatever the cause, flames roared across cedar beams, collapsing roofs and scorching reliefs. The city built to proclaim eternity lasted scarcely 2 centuries before falling into ruin. Even burned, Persepolis did not vanish. Its terraces endured, its staircases still climbed upward, its reliefs still gazed outward with calm dignity. Travelers who stumbled upon it in later centuries described columns rising from the plain like petrified trees. For locals, it was Takht-i-Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, linked to mythical kings of Persian lore. Much as Angkor became a city of legends to Cambodians, Persepolis became a site where myth and history fused, a reminder of glory so ancient it seemed superhuman. When European explorers arrived in the 17th century, they too marveled at the ruins, sketching columns and copying inscriptions without fully grasping their meaning. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries, with the deciphering of cuneiform, that Persepolis truly spoke again. In its inscriptions, Darius and Xerxes addressed the future directly, declaring who they were, what lands they ruled, and which gods sanctioned their power. The stones became more than silent witnesses. They were voices from 2.5 millennia ago, speaking across time. To stand at Persepolis today is to feel the strange duality of ruin and permanence. The city no longer functions, yet its scale still dwarfs you. Columns rise against the blue Iranian sky, staircases climb to nowhere, reliefs smile with ageless calm. The silence is not emptiness but echo. The echo of chants, processions, trumpets, and voices of hundreds of nations speaking dozens of tongues, all converging to acknowledge a single throne. Like Angkor and Troy, Persepolis forces us to confront the tension between ambition and impermanence. Empires rise to proclaim eternity, yet eternity belongs only to the stones. To imagine Persepolis only as a stage for kings is to see only half the picture. Behind the monumental columns and polished reliefs lay the labor of thousands whose names were never meant to be remembered. Archaeology has given them back their presence. Clay tablets discovered in the ruins, known as the Persepolis fortification tablets, record the rations of grain and wine distributed to workers, artisans, and even women and children employed on the terraces. Far from the faceless slaves imagined by earlier scholars, these inscriptions reveal a more complex reality. Families paid for their work, ration lists that included mothers nursing infants, craftsmen from across the empire brought to the city to lend their skill. The empire that proclaimed itself universal depended on this web of ordinary lives, woven together not by legend, but by contracts written in cuneiform. Life at Persepolis followed a rhythm set by ritual. At the festival of Nowruz, the New Year, the great audience hall filled with embassies from every corner of the empire. Picture the procession: Egyptians in linen carrying papyrus, Indians with ivory tusks, Medes in flowing robes leading horses, Bactrians bringing camels laden with rare goods. Each delegation climbed the broad staircases in single file, their figures carved forever in stone. They would present their gifts to the king, bow deeply, and speak words rehearsed for weeks. Musicians filled the air with drums and reed pipes. Priests intoned blessings to Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the Zoroastrian faith, and incense burned thick enough to veil the faces of the crowd. For the Persians, this was not simply ceremony, but proof that the world itself recognized the king's divine mandate. To the envoys, it was both duty and spectacle, a reminder of their place in a cosmic order. Beyond the halls of spectacle, daily labor kept the city alive. Quarrymen carved limestone blocks from nearby cliffs and dragged them across the plateau. Carpenters cut cedar beams imported from Lebanon. Jewelers etched delicate patterns into gold vessels, some destined to hold wine, others to be locked in storerooms for ceremonies yet to come. Archaeologists have uncovered workshops where artisans inscribed ivory plaques, where glassmakers experimented with new forms, where scribes copied administrative records with styluses pressed into clay. These spaces remind us that Persepolis was not just a symbol, but a living organism, its veins filled by workers whose craft gave life to the vision of kings. And there were women, more than many once expected. The tablets record women receiving rations of wine and barley, some commanding groups of workers, others traveling between sites. In a world where women are often erased from history, Persepolis leaves hints that they played roles not only in families, but in the economic fabric of the empire. Perhaps they supervised weaving workshops or managed supplies for the great festivals. Their names may be lost, but their existence is etched in the dry lines of accounting that paradoxically give more voice to daily life than the grandest reliefs. Ritual was everywhere. Fire altars burned before ceremonies, their flames representing the purity central to Zoroastrian thought. The king himself was both political ruler and spiritual guardian, his authority derived not merely from conquest, but from his duty to uphold Asha, the divine order that kept chaos at bay. When delegations bowed, they did not bow only to a man, but to the embodiment of cosmic balance. This intertwining of faith and power gave Persepolis its unique aura. It was less a capital than a temple of empire, where politics was performed as liturgy and where liturgy became politics. Even the architecture carried meaning. The staircases that rose so gradually, with steps shallow enough for horses to climb, allowed processions to maintain dignity. The reliefs of guards holding spears were not only decoration, but a visual message: order, vigilance, strength. The double-headed bull capitals atop columns symbolized guardianship, watching in two directions at once, as if to say the king's gaze extended everywhere. Every element spoke, every stone instructed. Visitors left with the unshakable sense that they had entered not a city, but a vision of the world arranged exactly as it should be. And yet, behind the symmetry, life remained fragile. Archaeologists found storerooms packed with jars once filled with grain and wine, suggesting that the court depended on constant inflows from across the empire. Such reliance made the system both vast and vulnerable. Roads and couriers linked Persepolis to distant provinces, but if rebellion, drought, or invasion broke those lines, the ceremonial city could quickly fall silent. It had no fields of its own, no bustling markets to sustain it independently. Its greatness lay in being the center of a wheel, but wheels turn only as long as the spokes hold. The workers must have known this. When they carved the reliefs of tribute bearers, when they hauled columns into place, they were building not their own homes, but symbols for rulers who claimed eternity. Perhaps some felt pride to be part of such grandeur, their children pointing to the rising columns and boasting that their fathers had shaped them. Others may have felt only weariness, their lives consumed by a city that offered awe but not permanence. In either case, their hands left marks that still endure, proof that empires are sustained as much by the anonymous many as by the celebrated few. To walk among Persepolis today is to sense both splendor and silence. Reliefs still line the staircases, showing faces so detailed that you can see the braids in their beards, the folds in their robes, the gifts in their hands. Yet no musicians play, no incense burns, no envoys bow. The courtyards are empty, filled only with wind. The fire altars are cold. What remains is the shape of ritual without the sound, an echo of order carved into stone. In that echo lies the paradox of Persepolis, a city designed to embody eternity, but now surviving as ruin, its messages still legible even when its voice has long gone silent. Like Angkor and Troy, Persepolis forces us to confront the scale of human ambition. Angkor reached for the heavens through temples in the jungle. Troy burned itself into memory through poetry. Persepolis declared itself eternal through ceremony carved in stone. Each rose differently, each fell differently, but all remind us of the same truth, that what we call civilization is always a fragile performance, dependent on faith, power, and the countless hands of ordinary people. The fall of Persepolis came not slowly, as with Angkor, nor shrouded in uncertainty, as with Troy, but in fire so bright it left scars still visible on the stone. In the winter of 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon marched into the Persian heartland after crushing Darius III at Gaugamela. The once mighty Achaemenid Empire had been reduced to fragments, its armies scattered, its king fleeing eastward. When Alexander reached Persepolis, he did not find a battlefield, but a treasury. The terraces still gleamed with columns. Storerooms bulged with gold and silver gathered from across the empire, and the great palaces of Darius and Xerxes stood largely intact. Ancient accounts claim that the Macedonian soldiers marveled at the wealth, saying no other city in the world could match it. For a moment, Persepolis stood as it always had, an image of empire. But that moment would not last. The decision to burn Persepolis remains one of history's great debates. Some sources say Alexander sought revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece a century and a half earlier, when Xerxes had sacked Athens and burned its temples. Others suggest that it was drunken impulse, the result of a revel in which the courtesan Thais urged the conqueror to set fire to the city as a final act of triumph. Whatever the motive, torches were lit, flames leapt to cedar beams, and the palaces built to proclaim eternity were reduced to ash within hours. Stone reliefs cracked under the heat, painted walls turned black, and roofs collapsed in showers of sparks. The fire devoured more than wood and treasure. It consumed the illusion of permanence itself. Archaeological evidence confirms the ancient accounts. Layers of soot still mark the bases of columns, and charred timbers lie preserved in the rubble. The grandeur of Persepolis was not dismantled over generations, but destroyed in a single night of fire. For the Persians, it must have seemed as though the gods themselves had abandoned the empire, allowing its most sacred space to fall. For Alexander, whether by plan or chance, The act sealed his claim to be master not only of Persian armies, but of Persian memory. By burning Persepolis, he announced the end of one world and the beginning of another. Yet destruction did not erase the city. Its terraces remained, its staircases endured, and its reliefs, though blackened, still stared outward with calm serenity. Travelers in later centuries were awed by what survived. They saw columns rising from the plain like petrified giants, staircases so broad they seemed to climb into the sky, and reliefs of men bringing tribute that looked almost alive. To them, the ruins were not merely evidence of past glory, but mysteries in stone, too vast to belong only to human hands. Local tradition renamed the site Takht-e-Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, linking it to the mythical king said to have ruled the world in Iran's distant past. Much as Angkor became a city of gods in Cambodian legend, Persepolis became a monument of Persian myth, absorbed into stories that blurred history with timeless fable. When European travelers reached Persia in the 17th century, they too were struck by Persepolis. Artists sketched its terraces, columns, and reliefs, carrying the images back to Europe, where they inspired awe and speculation. Scholars compared the ruins to those of Greece and Rome, marveling that such grandeur had come not from the Mediterranean, but from Asia. For centuries, Western histories had painted Persia as a barbarian enemy, remembered mainly through the lens of Greek writers. But Persepolis forced a reevaluation. Here was evidence of a civilization as refined and ambitious as any in the West, a reminder that empires rise and fall not by geography, but by vision. The deciphering of cuneiform in the 19th century gave Persepolis its voice once more. Inscriptions carved high on walls and staircases, invisible to casual visitors, spoke in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. They declared the names of Darius and Xerxes, the boundaries of their empire, and their devotion to Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. One inscription by Darius reads, "By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am king. These are the lands that I rule: Persia, Elam, Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, the lands of the Medes, Armenia, Cappadocia, Lydia, Ionia, and the peoples of the sea." To read those words on the very walls of Persepolis was to hear the kings themselves speak across 2,500 years, their voices preserved even as their empire perished. The memory of Persepolis carried different meanings to different peoples. For Persians, it became both pride and lamentation, proof of their ancestors' greatness, but also a reminder of conquest and humiliation. For Europeans, it became a marvel, proof that Asia held wonders equal to Greece or Rome. For historians, it became a key to understanding how empires govern diversity, for the reliefs show not slaves in chains, but delegations walking with dignity, their costumes and gifts testifying to cultures preserved within imperial order. Persepolis was both propaganda and reality, both vision and practice. Its fall under Alexander symbolized not merely the end of a city, but the transformation of the ancient world from Persian to Hellenistic. Even in ruin, Persepolis shapes imagination. To walk there today is to feel both loss and continuity. The great staircases still rise, their steps shallow and deliberate, as if waiting for processions that will never come. The reliefs still show Egyptians carrying papyrus, Indians with ivory, Lydians with wine vessels, their faces calm, their gestures timeless. The Apadana's columns still thrust skyward, their bull-headed capitals gazing silently across the plain. The fire may have taken the color, the sound, the life, but it left the form, an echo of empire preserved in stone. Persepolis, like Angkor and Troy, teaches us that civilizations fall not only to enemies, but to time, accident, and choice. The Persians built it to embody eternity, but eternity proved shorter than they hoped. Alexander burned it in a night, yet the ruins outlived him by millennia. Perhaps that is the final irony. That destruction itself became preservation, for by turning Persepolis into ruin, Alexander ensured it would never fade quietly into history, but remain a monument of both creation and loss. Persepolis did not vanish into silence after Alexander's fire. For the people who lived in its shadow, the ruins became part of their own mythology, woven into the threads of Persian identity. They no longer saw it as Persepolis, the city of Darius and Xerxes, but as Takht-e-Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, home of a mythical king said to have ruled the world in an age of wonders. Jamshid, in Persian lore, was a figure of both brilliance and hubris. He brought prosperity and mastery over nature, but his pride angered the gods, and his throne was eventually taken away. That the ruins of Persepolis became tied to Jamshid reveals how deeply the Persians understood their own history, not as a simple tale of glory, but as a warning about the fragility of power. Even in ruin, Persepolis remained a touchstone for Persian memory. Poets invoked it as a symbol of grandeur and loss. The great epic of Iran, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, written 1,000 years after Persepolis burned, wove echoes of such vanished palaces into its tales of kings and heroes. Travelers visiting the site spoke of awe and melancholy, for the stones seemed to embody both the height of human ambition and the certainty of human decline. In this sense, Persepolis was never just architecture. It was philosophy carved in limestone, a meditation on the fleeting nature of empire. At the heart of its symbolism was the religion of the Achaemenids, Zoroastrianism. Though no fire altars burn there now, Persepolis was shaped by its worldview. Zoroastrian thought divided existence into the forces of Asha, order and truth, and Drauj, chaos and deceit. The king was the earthly guarantor of Asha, responsible not only for governing people, but for maintaining cosmic balance. Every tribute procession carved into stone, every stairway leading upward, every column topped with vigilant animals reinforced this cosmic alignment. To betray the king was not only treason, but sacrilege, a tilt toward chaos itself. When Alexander burned the palaces, Persians must have felt not only the loss of a city, but the shattering of a cosmic order. And yet, that order never fully died. In villages and towns across Persia, fire temples continued to burn, their flames guarded as symbols of divine truth. Centuries later, when Islam swept across the region, the ruins of Persepolis stood as silent witnesses, neither erased nor forgotten. Muslim chroniclers described them with a mixture of respect and suspicion, wondering what long-vanished giants had built such marvels. The stones survived invasions, earthquakes, and neglect, as though the very earth refused to let them vanish completely. In the modern era, Persepolis became a national emblem. When Iran marked the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire in 1971, it was at Persepolis that Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi staged an extravagant celebration. World leaders dined in tents on the ancient terrace, fireworks lit the night, and the Shah proclaimed himself heir to Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. To him, Persepolis was proof that Iran's greatness stretched back millennia, that the modern nation was heir to the first empire that sought to rule by both power and law. The spectacle was immense, but it also revealed the tension inherent in all ruins. They can inspire, but they can also warn. Within a decade, revolution swept the Shah from power, reminding everyone that ruins do not only speak of past empires, they also whisper about the fate of present ones. Comparing Persepolis to Angkor and Troy sharpens its meaning. Angkor grew from the jungle and was reclaimed by it, its fall a slow erosion of faith and environment. Troy burned in war, but lived on in poetry, its stones forgotten until rediscovered. Persepolis, by contrast, was deliberately destroyed in fire, yet never fully erased, because its terraces were too massive to vanish and its memory too central to Persian identity. Angkor was silenced until science uncovered it. Troy was dismissed until archaeology proved it real. Persepolis never truly left human consciousness. It shifted from history into myth, then back again into history once scholars read its inscriptions. Each city teaches a different lesson about how civilizations die and how memory keeps them alive. What Persepolis shares with the others is the paradox of impermanence and endurance. Built to embody eternity, it fell in a single night, yet its ruins have lasted longer than the empire that created them. Its builders carved processions into stone to proclaim unity, and those processions still march in silence today, outlasting the languages, the kings, and the gods they once served. Persepolis proves that while empires are fragile, symbols endure, and sometimes symbols matter more than armies. To walk through Persepolis now is to feel the weight of time pressing from all directions. The staircases are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, but they still rise as if awaiting ambassadors. The reliefs are weathered, yet the folds of robes and braids of hair remain clear, faces calm as though frozen outside of time. The columns cast shadows across the plain, reminders that once this place was alive with voices in a dozen tongues. It is quiet now, but not silent. The stones speak in their own way, telling us that power fades, but memory, whether through myth, poetry, or ruin, can last longer than any king's command. In Persepolis, as in Angkor and Troy, we find reflections of ourselves. Our monuments, our cities, our faith in permanence are always temporary, yet our longing to be remembered is eternal. The ruins remind us that civilizations are not only measured by how long they last, but by how deeply they imprint themselves on human imagination. To stand before the ruins of Persepolis is to stand before that paradox: fragility carved in stone, endurance born from destruction. The shadow of Persepolis stretches long, not only across the Iranian plateau, but across the way we think about power itself. To stand there is to feel the dual pull of awe and melancholy. Awe, because the ruins still dazzle, even in their silence. Melancholy, because the very stones were meant to embody permanence, and yet here they are, broken, blackened, enduring only as fragments. In that tension lies the essence of human ambition. We build as though forever, yet forever slips through our fingers. Persepolis reminds us that no king, however great, no empire, however vast, escapes the truth of time. When we place Persepolis beside Angkor and Troy, patterns emerge like threads woven into a larger tapestry. Angkor tells us of faith and environment. It rose because of divine kingship and mastery of water, and it fell when belief fractured and nature reclaimed what had been bent to human will. Troy tells us of war and memory. It burned, yet lived on in poetry, its stones forgotten until rediscovered, proof that stories can sometimes outlast ruins. Persepolis tells us of spectacle and destruction. It was designed as theater of empire, meant to be eternal, and yet its eternity ended in a single night of fire. Each city shows us a different face of fragility. Faith undone, war endured, fire consumed. And yet, each also shows us endurance in unexpected forms. Angkor's temples, once lost, now rise again as national pride, visited by millions who whisper at dawn as sunlight gilds the lotus towers. Troy, though reduced to humble foundations, thrives in imagination. Children still read of Achilles and Hector, Helen and Paris, as though their fates remain unresolved. Persepolis, scarred by flame, still commands reverence. Its reliefs, though weathered, still march in silence, a procession no conqueror could erase. Together, they teach us that endurance does not always mean survival as originally intended. Sometimes it means transformation, from stone into myth, from ruin into memory, from silence into rediscovery. Consider how each city engaged with time. Angkor grew over centuries, expanding like a living forest, temples sprouting one after another, its rulers layering stone upon stone until the jungle crept back and swallowed it whole. Troy lived in cycles of destruction and rebuilding, 9 cities layered one atop another, culminating in the one sung by Homer, then buried again until spades revealed its bones. Persepolis was sudden, built in grandeur, destroyed in a night, preserved as ruin, mythologized as throne of Jamshid, and finally restored as history. 3 rhythms: slow erosion, layered rebirth, abrupt conflagration. Each reminds us that time wears down civilizations in different ways, but always relentlessly. And yet we return to them. Why? Perhaps because ruins satisfy a paradox in the human heart. We fear forgetting, yet we are drawn to what has been forgotten. We live in the present, yet we long to touch eternity. To walk through Angkor, Troy, or Persepolis is to stand in both past and present at once. The stones anchor us, the myths carry us, and the silence forces us to listen. They are mirrors more than monuments, reflecting back our own desire to be remembered, our fear of vanishing without trace. Modern science has given us tools that the ancients could never have imagined. Radar mapping Angkor beneath jungle, carbon dating ash in Troy, deciphering inscriptions at Persepolis. But even with these, mystery remains. We know more now than Muhat, Schliemann, or those first Europeans who stumbled across columns in the desert, but the core questions persist. How does belief sustain a city? How does memory outlast destruction? How does spectacle disguise fragility? These are questions no amount of data can fully answer because they are not only historical, but human. The stories of these cities remind us that history is not linear, nor is it neat. Civilizations rise and fall, but they also echo, resurfacing in myths, in ruins, in identities reshaped centuries later. Angkor was never truly forgotten by Cambodians. Monks still prayed there. Troy never disappeared from the imagination. Poets kept it alive. Persepolis never vanished from the Persian mind. It became a throne of legend. What we call rediscovery is often simply the moment when outsiders finally learn what locals already knew, that the past is not gone, only waiting. In Angkor, The jungle whispers that nature outlasts us. In Troy, the ash whispers that stories outlast us. In Persepolis, the columns whisper that symbols outlast us. Together they weave a truth too large to ignore, that we cannot control eternity, but we can touch it briefly, leave impressions deep enough to survive in some form, even after our cities crumble. Civilizations may be fragile, but memory is stubborn, and that stubbornness is perhaps our truest legacy. As the sun sets behind Persepolis's broken columns, the comparison sharpens. The faces on the staircases still gaze outward with calm, as though they know their duty continues even after empires fall. The jungle still closes around Angkor, but each dawn the towers rise again, lotus-shaped against the sky, as though no war or drought ever ended them. The plain of Troy lies quiet, the mound unimpressive, yet in the mind's eye the walls rise, the gates thunder, the horse rolls forward, and fire consumes the night. 3 cities, 3 lessons, 1 story, that the human desire to last forever will always be answered by time's silence, but also by time's memory. Across continents and centuries, Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis seem to share nothing at first glance. One rose in a humid jungle, its towers shaped like lotus flowers. Another stood on a windy hill by the sea, immortalized in epic verse. The third loomed on a desert plateau, a stage for emperors to display their might. Yet when we listen closely, their stories echo each other, forming variations on the same melody, the cycle of civilization. Rise, flourish, fracture, fall, and in the ruins, memory persists. Civilizations rise when humans learn to turn landscape into architecture of power. At Angkor, it was water, vast reservoirs and canals that bent the jungle to human will. At Troy, it was geography, a strait that controlled trade between seas. At Persepolis, it was ceremony, terraces carved into the earth to embody an empire. Different resources, different strategies, yet all driven by the same impulse, to transform place into permanence, to say, we are here and we will always be here. Each city was a gamble against time, and for a while, each succeeded. But flourishing brings fragility. The more complex a city becomes, the more it depends on balance. Angkor thrived on faith in god-kings, but when faith splintered and water failed, the jungle reclaimed the stones. Troy thrived on trade, but its position made it a prize. Conflict was inevitable, and fire erased its walls. Persepolis thrived on spectacle, but it was spectacle without self-sufficiency. One conqueror's torch turned it into a stage of ashes. What undoes civilizations is rarely weakness alone. It is imbalance, the tipping of a scale too finely weighted. And yet, the fall is never the end. Each city found a way to endure beyond collapse, though never in the way its builders intended. Angkor survived in the prayers of monks, its stones a living monastery even when the jungle closed in. Troy survived in song, where Achilles and Hector fought forever in verses memorized across ages. Persepolis survived in myth, renamed the throne of Jamshid, its ruins integrated into new stories of kingship. The endurance of cities lies not in bricks, but in the human imagination that refuses to forget them. This cycle, creation, fracture, endurance, is not confined to the ancient world. It mirrors the trajectory of all human endeavors. Nations rise with vision, falter with overreach, and live on in what they leave behind. Even our modern skylines, of glass and steel, are no less vulnerable than lotus towers, stone walls, or cedar beams. We like to believe progress shields us from collapse, But Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis remind us that collapse is not the end. It is transformation. There is also a spiritual thread binding these cities. Each was shaped by belief, faith in divine kings at Angkor, faith in heroic destiny at Troy, faith in cosmic order at Persepolis. Their stones, stories, and ceremonies were not only functional, but sacred. When they fell, people did not simply mourn cities, they mourned worlds. And yet those worlds left behind something larger than themselves. Angkor's temples still breathe with incense and prayer. Troy's verses still pulse with the rhythm of human struggle. Persepolis's reliefs still teach order and unity through silent processions. Belief may fade, but the symbols it carves endure. To look at these ruins is to recognize ourselves. We too build systems of faith, commerce, and spectacle. We too carve our values into monuments, whether temples, skyscrapers, or digital networks. We too imagine permanence even as we sense fragility. The ruins whisper that our time is no different, that the cycle continues. But they also whisper that meaning persists. Even when empires vanish, even when cities fall, what they stood for can still inspire, caution, or console. Philosophers have long wrestled with this paradox. Heraclitus said that everything flows, that nothing stands still. Yet ruins seem to contradict him, frozen in place, lasting beyond the lives of their makers. But perhaps they do not contradict. Perhaps they prove his point. For ruins are not fixed. They are transformation embodied. Columns weather, reliefs fade, stories shift, meanings evolve. The ruins of Angkor are not the same as they were to Jayavarman. The ruins of Troy are not the same as they were to Homer. The ruins of Persepolis are not the same as they were to Darius. Each age reshapes them, flowing around their stones, turning permanence into motion once more. When we step back, the lesson is not despair but humility. Civilizations fall, but the human longing to build, to believe, to be remembered never falls. It rises again and again, in temples, in stories, in monuments. The ruins remind us that the end is not the opposite of the beginning, but its partner. Angkor's silence, Troy's song, Persepolis's flame, all are part of the same story, a story we continue to tell by seeking them out, by listening to their echoes, by weaving them into our own. In the end, perhaps that is why we are drawn to ruins, not because they are broken, but because they are alive in a way no perfect city can ever be. They show us time not as enemy but as collaborator, shaping meaning long after builders are gone. Angkor, Troy, Persepolis. 3 names, 3 places, 3 lessons, each different, each the same. Each a reminder that what is fragile can endure, and what endures is never what we expect. The ruins of Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis whisper of fragility and endurance, but they are not alone. The cycle they embody, creation, fracture, endurance, has echoed across the world in countless forms. To trace it is to see humanity's pattern written on every continent. Each civilization thinks itself singular, yet its story rhymes with those that came before and those yet to come. Consider the Mayan cities of Central America. Like Angkor, they rose in jungles, their temples piercing the canopy, their plazas alive with ritual. The Maya mastered astronomy, charted calendars more precise than those of Europe, and built cities of stone that seemed eternal. But drought, warfare, and overextension fractured their networks. By the time Europeans arrived, many cities had already been reclaimed by jungle. For centuries, outsiders believed the Maya had vanished, but like Angkor, they had not disappeared. They had transformed. Their descendants still lived, their languages still spoken, their traditions still practiced. The stones may have been hidden, but the people endured. Memory persisted not only in ruins, but in blood. Or take the Indus Valley civilization, whose cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, flourished thousands of years before Persepolis. They built with such order that streets ran in grids, drainage systems carried away waste, and houses rose in careful alignment. To walk their ruins today is to feel the pulse of a society that prized balance and planning. And yet, around 1900 BCE, the cities declined. Some say climate change shifted rivers, some say trade routes moved, others that internal strain weakened them. Whatever the cause, the cities emptied, their script undeciphered, their rulers forgotten. But the memory lingers in mystery itself. How could a civilization so advanced vanish so completely? Like Troy before Schliemann, the Indus Valley survives more in questions than in answers. Its endurance is the puzzle it leaves us. Even Rome, whose grandeur feels closer to us, followed the same arc. The eternal city, mistress of the Mediterranean, builder of aqueducts, roads, and amphitheaters, seemed unshakable. But it too fractured under pressures of war, economy, and overreach. When the Western Empire fell, its forums crumbled, its aqueducts broke, its statues toppled. For centuries, shepherds grazed sheep among the ruins of the Colosseum, and pilgrims quarried marble from temples once dedicated to gods. Yet Rome never vanished. It endured in the church that rose within it, in the laws and languages that spread from it, in the very idea of empire that rulers across Europe claimed as their own. Rome's endurance, like Persepolis's, lay in becoming symbol as much as place. The pattern even reaches into myth. Atlantis, though no ruins have been found, occupies the same imaginative space as Troy once did. A story dismissed as fable, yet powerful enough to endure for millennia. Whether Plato's tale was allegory, memory, or invention matters less than the fact that it survives. People search oceans and deserts for its traces, convinced that somewhere the stones of Atlantis wait. In that search, we see the same hunger that drew explorers to Angkor, Schliemann to Troy, and travelers to Persepolis. We need to believe that the past hides secrets, that memory can be recovered, that civilizations never truly vanish. When seen together, these examples reveal that civilization is less a line than a cycle. It rises on vision, it fractures under strain, and it endures in forms unexpected. Ruin, myth, story, symbol. The specific causes differ. Drought in the jungle, fire on the plain, conquest in the desert. But the pattern repeats. Each city, each empire, is a rehearsal of the same drama. Human ambition straining against time, time answering with silence, memory answering back with echo. This recognition is humbling. We often think of our age as exceptional, as though skyscrapers and satellites have freed us from fragility. Yet the ruins remind us otherwise. Our grids of electricity, our networks of data, our engines of commerce, all are as dependent on balance as Angkor's canals, Troy's harbor, or Persepolis's tributary roads. Drought, war, imbalance, they wear new names, but their essence remains. The cycle has not ended, it has only changed costume. But humility need not mean despair. If civilizations fall, they also leave gifts. Angkor left lessons in architecture and water management. Troy left epics that still shape our sense of heroism. Persepolis left visions of order carved in stone. Rome left law. The Maya left mathematics. The Indus left mystery. Even collapse produces continuity. In ruins, we inherit not only stones but ideas, and those ideas thread into our own. To study ruins is not to mourn, but to listen, to hear what remains alive in what is gone. Perhaps that is why we keep returning. Tourists at Angkor wake before dawn to see sunlight strike the lotus towers, as if to witness the rebirth of faith. Visitors at Troy gaze at low walls, yet imagine Helen's face and Achilles' rage, as if to stand inside a poem. Travelers at Persepolis walk the staircases slowly, as if envoys still carrying gifts. Each ruin becomes a stage where we perform not only memory, but imagination, where we remind ourselves that we are part of a longer story. Civilizations may be fragile, but the human longing to leave a mark is not. It rises again in every generation, in new cities, new monuments, new myths. Angkor, Troy, Persepolis, they are not only past but prophecy, telling us that our present too will one day be ruin, our monuments too will one day be echoes. And yet, if memory endures, if imagination persists, perhaps that is enough. For in the end, we do not seek eternity for stone, we seek eternity for meaning. What makes ruins so magnetic is not only their scale or beauty, but the questions they force upon us. Why do humans, again and again, pour so much labor into creating structures they know will outlast their own lives? Why carve processions into stone, raise towers toward the sky, or inscribe laws on walls? The answer, whispered by Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis, is that we build not only to live, but to be remembered. Civilization is not merely shelter and sustenance, it is performance aimed at eternity. At Angkor, the god-kings did not raise temples only for ritual, but as anchors of cosmic order, each tower a lotus stem linking earth to heaven. They sought to bind their people not only through power, but through vision, a city that made the unseen visible. At Troy, the walls stood not only for defense, but for identity, a claim to permanence against the shifting tides of war. To breach them was not simply conquest, it was erasure. At Persepolis, terraces and columns were more than stone. They were theater, staging the empire's claim that the world itself bent toward the king. Each city built meaning into matter, hoping meaning would last. Yet permanence always eludes us. The jungle swallows temples, fire reduces palaces to ash, memory outpaces stone. The paradox is painful. We strive for eternity, but time reminds us of our limits. And still we try. Perhaps because fragility itself is what drives us. If we were eternal, we would not need monuments, stories, or rituals. It is precisely because we are fleeting that we carve names, build towers, and tell stories. Our impermanence fuels our creativity. The ruins teach us this. Fragility is not failure, but the spark of ambition. In this way, ruins do not only warn, they console. To walk through Angkor is to realize that even after centuries of silence, faith can return. To stand at Troy is to realize that stories can keep a city alive longer than walls ever could. To climb Persepolis' staircases is to realize that symbols can endure even when empires burn. The ruins suggest that though our works may fall, the essence of what we sought, meaning memory, identity, can survive in forms we never expected. This search for permanence is not confined to stones. It is in the stories we pass down, the art we paint, the music we compose, the data we inscribe in servers humming beneath modern cities. We imagine permanence in the digital as once we imagined it in the monumental. But history whispers that no medium is immune. Clay tablets cracked, papyrus rotted, marble toppled, and one day, perhaps, even our digital archives will vanish. Yet as with ruins, meaning will persist if imagination persists. Memory does not depend on material alone. It depends on desire. And desire, across millennia, has proven inexhaustible. Philosophers have said that to be human is to know we will die, and to create anyway. Angkor's lotus towers, Troy's walls, Persepolis's columns, they are all acts of defiance against time, declarations that we refuse to vanish quietly. The ruins remind us that while defiance may fail materially, it succeeds symbolically. We look at the jungle's embrace of Angkor and feel not only loss, but awe. We look at Troy's ashes and feel not only tragedy, but inspiration. We look at Persepolis's blackened stones and feel not only destruction, but continuity. Failure becomes another form of endurance. This is why ruins matter now, in our own time. They remind us that what we build today will also become ruin, but that ruin is not the end. Skyscrapers may fall, networks may collapse, nations may fade, but memory will persist if meaning persists. We do not seek eternity for stone. We seek eternity for what stone represents, our need to connect, to believe, to matter. Angkor, Troy, Persepolis. They are not simply relics of the past, but mirrors of our present and foreshadowings of our future. To recognize this is to accept both humility and hope. Humility, because we are not exempt from the cycle. Our empires and cities will fade as surely as theirs. Hope, because fading is not the same as vanishing. We too will leave echoes, stories, symbols, ruins that will whisper to those who come after us. The cycle is not tragedy, but continuity. We inherit echoes. We leave echoes. That is what it means to be human. So the ruins teach us not despair, but perspective. They remind us that civilizations are not measured only by how long they last, but by how deeply they imprint themselves on imagination. Angkor imprinted faith. Troy imprinted heroism. Persepolis imprinted unity. Each fell, yet each still shapes us. The ruins suggest that our task is not to escape fragility, but to use it, to build with awareness that what we create may crumble, but that the meaning we embed can outlast the matter. As the sun sets behind the columns of Persepolis, the towers of Angkor, the mound of Troy, the lesson becomes clear. Eternity was never in the stone. It was always in the story. The ruins endure not because they resist time, but because we continue to look at them and ask, what do they mean? And as long as we ask, they live. The cycle of Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis grows clearer when we place them beside other ruins scattered across the world. Each site carries its own flavor of mystery, but together they reinforce the same truth: that human beings, across time and geography, are driven by the same impulse to carve meaning into the earth, and that time, across centuries, reshapes those meanings in ways no builder could have predicted. Consider Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, far in the Pacific Ocean. Here, volcanic stone was carved into colossal figures, the Moai, their faces long and solemn, their backs to the sea. They stand as if watching over the island, guardians whose purpose is both obvious and elusive. Archaeologists say they were built to honor ancestors, embodying mana, the spiritual power believed to flow through lineage. But why such scale on such an isolated island? To erect them, people hauled stones weighing many tons across rough terrain, using ropes, sledges, and sheer determination. The effort strained the island's resources, leading to deforestation, soil erosion, and decline. Like Angkor's reservoirs, Troy's straits, or Persepolis's terraces, the Moai represent both achievement and fragility. The statues still stand, weathered by centuries of salt and wind, silent witnesses to a people's grandeur and their struggle with limits. Machu Picchu, in the high Andes of Peru, tells another variation. Built by the Inca in the 15th century, it clings to a ridge between mountains, clouds drifting through its terraces and temples. For centuries, it lay hidden, unknown to the outside world, until rediscovered in 1911 by Hiram Bingham. Its stones fit so precisely that not even a blade of grass slips between them, a mastery of masonry that seems impossible without iron tools. Yet Machu Picchu was not a fortress, nor a vast capital like Persepolis. It was more intimate, a royal estate, a ceremonial retreat, perhaps a place where rulers sought communion with gods among peaks they considered sacred. Its endurance came not from monumental scale, but from concealment. The jungle did not destroy it, as it did Angkor. The Spaniards never found it, as they destroyed other Inca cities. Hidden in the clouds, Machu Picchu survived precisely because it was forgotten. Its survival teaches that sometimes fragility becomes protection, that disappearance can be a form of endurance. And then there is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, older than all the rest. 12,000 years ago, long before cities or pottery, before written language or bronze tools, people gathered on a hill to carve massive limestone pillars into circles. Each pillar bore animals, foxes, birds, snakes, etched with striking skill. The site was deliberately buried after centuries of use, preserved by the very people who built it. Its discovery in the 1990s overturned assumptions about human history. Civilizations were supposed to rise after farming. Yet here was monumental architecture built by hunter-gatherers, suggesting that belief and ritual may have come before settlement. Göbekli Tepe is not a ruin of an empire, but a ruin of an idea. That humans, even at the dawn of society, already sought permanence through stone, already carved their imagination into the earth. It is the earliest echo of the same cycle that gave us Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis. What links Easter Island, Machu Picchu, and Göbekli Tepe to our three cities is not geography or culture, but the human impulse they embody. Each site, in its own way, is a conversation with time. The Moai face inward, reminding descendants of their ancestors' power. Machu Picchu clings to mountains, whispering of communion with the divine. Göbekli Tepe rises from prehistory, reminding us that memory begins not with writing, but with vision. Angkor reached for the heavens, Troy defended its honor, Persepolis staged empire. All are variations on the same theme. We know we are temporary, and so we build as if we are not. And in each case, endurance has taken forms the builders never foresaw. The Rapa Nui could not have known their statues would one day become symbols of resilience for a small island struggling against environmental and political pressures. The Inca could not have imagined Machu Picchu would become a global icon. its terraces filled with tourists from continents they never knew existed. The builders of Göbekli Tepe could not have imagined that their buried circles would one day rewrite the story of human beginnings. Just as Angkor became Cambodia's soul, Troy became poetry's battlefield, and Persepolis became Iran's throne of myth, so too these other ruins remind us that meaning survives even when context vanishes. Together, they expand the cycle into something larger than history. It becomes anthropology, psychology, even theology. They show that humans are a species defined not only by survival, but by symbol. Other animals build nests, hives, or dens, but only we build cities to reach gods, walls to immortalize war, terraces to stage ceremony, statues to embody ancestors, temples to carve mystery, estates to touch the sky. Only we transform stone into story, and only we, paradoxically, find meaning in ruins, long after their builders are gone. To walk among these sites is to feel the scale of that paradox. The Moai are silent, yet they speak. Machu Picchu is empty, yet it hums with presence. Göbekli Tepe is incomplete, yet it completes our understanding of ourselves. Angkor, Troy, Persepolis, they join this chorus, each ruin adding a verse to the same hymn. That fragility and endurance are partners, not opposites, and that meaning does not die with the stones that once carried it. And so the pattern expands. From jungles to deserts, mountains to islands, plains to hills, the story is the same. We build, we fall, we endure. Not always in the form we intended, not always in the place we expected, but endure we do. Ruins remind us of what is lost, but they also remind us of what remains: hope, memory, imagination. In their silence, they tell us that fragility is not the end, but the beginning of transformation. The ruins scattered across the world remind us that the border between myth and history is not a wall, but a veil, shifting with time. Angkor was said to have been built overnight by divine beings. Troy was long thought to be only a poet's dream, and Persepolis became the throne of a mythical king. Easter Island's Moai were once explained as the work of giants, Machu Picchu imagined as a lost city of the Incas, Göbekli Tepe unthinkable until its stones emerged from the soil. Each site teaches that what we call myth and what we call history are often the same story told at different moments, wearing different names. Myth begins as explanation, a way for people to frame what they cannot measure. When Cambodians saw the towering temples of Angkor, overgrown yet still sublime, they spoke of gods raising them in a single night, because no human hands could seem equal to the task. When Greeks recited the Iliad, they kept alive not only tales of heroes, but dim memories of real battles, blurred by centuries of retelling. When Persians looked at Persepolis after Alexander's fire, they saw not Darius's terraces but Jamshid's throne, because myth filled the silence left by loss. In each case, myth was not deception but continuity, a way to carry memory forward when details crumbled. History, in turn, is myth reinterpreted. When explorers, archaeologists, and scholars arrived centuries later, they stripped away layers of legend, but never destroyed them entirely. Instead, they layered new meanings. Henri Mouhot's Rediscovery of Angkor in the 19th century reframed it as history rather than fable, but the myth of divine builders lingered in the shadows of its towers. Schliemann Spade proved Troy was more than poetry, yet Homer's verses still shape how we imagine it. Archaeologists deciphered inscriptions at Persepolis, restoring Darius and Xerxes to memory, but locals still call it Takht-e-Jamshid, a mythical throne. History does not erase myth, it coexists with it, weaving together fact and fable into a richer tapestry. Perhaps the reason is that both myth and history serve the same hunger, to make sense of ruins, to give them voice. Myths tell us why a city was great, why it fell, why its stones still stand. History tells us how people built, how they fought, how they governed. One is poetry, the other analysis, but both are attempts to answer the same silence. To walk through ruins is to feel that silence pressing on you, demanding explanation. Myth offers wonder, history offers context, but neither is complete without the other. The interplay can be seen most clearly at Troy. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as legend, until Schliemann proved there were cities beneath Hisarlik. Yet no excavation can give us Helen's face, no trench can reveal Achilles' rage. Archaeology gives walls and ashes, myth gives passion and meaning. Without archaeology, Troy would remain a dream. Without myth, Troy would be just another ruin. Its endurance lies in the marriage of both. At Angkor, the same balance exists. LiDAR scans reveal city grids, water systems, and population estimates. History gives us engineers and kings, but myth gives us a deeper resonance. Towers shaped as lotus stems, divine beings building by night, temples that mirror the universe itself. Without myth, Angkor would be impressive but not transcendent. Without history, it would be enchanting but not real. Together they make it both grounded and luminous. And Persepolis, its blackened stones speak of fire, looted treasuries, political collapse. That is history. But the name Takht-e-Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, gives it afterlife as legend. Even in ruin, it became more than Darius's city. It became a symbol of cosmic kingship, of human pride and divine retribution. Without history, we would miss the inscriptions that reveal law and empire. Without myth, we would miss the poetry of its endurance. The ruins teach us that myth and history are not rivals, but partners. Myth carries memory when facts are lost. History anchors memory when myth alone drifts too far. And together, they ensure that ruins are never mute. Even when stones crumble, even when texts decay, even when details vanish, the combination of story and soil ensures continuity. This blurring is not unique to ancient times. We do the same today. Our monuments are layered with myth even before they fall. Skyscrapers are not just steel, they are myths of ambition. Memorials are not just stone, they are myths of sacrifice. Digital networks are not just servers, they are myths of connection. Someday, when our cities too are ruins, archaeologists may measure our structures, but future myths will carry our meaning. They will tell stories of who we were, why we built, why we fell. Just as we mythologize Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis, so too will we be mythologized. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of ruins, that history and myth are never separate. They are two ways of answering the same human need, two ways of refusing silence. When we stand at Angkor, Troy, Persepolis, Easter Island, Machu Picchu, or Göbekli Tepe, we are not only looking at stones, we are looking at mirrors, reflecting our own need to explain, to remember, to endure. The line between myth and history is not a flaw, but a gift, because it allows us to keep ruins alive in imagination long after their builders are gone. When we place all these ruins together, Angkor in the jungle, Troy on the windswept plain, Persepolis on the desert plateau, Easter Island in the Pacific, Machu Picchu in the Andes, Göbekli Tepe on its forgotten hill, we begin to see not isolated sites, but a single story unfolding across time. It is the story of how humanity wrestles with its own fragility, how we answer the knowledge of impermanence with acts of permanence, how we carve our hopes into stone even as we know stone itself will someday crumble. Angkor shows us the vulnerability of faith and environment. Its reservoirs once glittered with divine order, its temples radiated cosmic power, but when water failed and belief fractured, the jungle reclaimed its towers. Troy shows us the vulnerability of war. Its walls fell not only to spears, but to the imagination of poets who carried its fire forward, making myth the truest weapon of all. Persepolis shows us the vulnerability of spectacle. Built to embody eternity, it was undone in a single night of flames, its grandeur collapsing into ruin, yet paradoxically becoming eternal through the very ruin meant to erase it. When we look at them together, a pattern emerges. Civilizations are not destroyed only by drought or conquest or neglect. They fall because they are human, and to be human is to be fragile. But in that fragility lies their endurance. Angkor survived because monks prayed in its ruins. Troy survived because poets sang its story. Persepolis survived because Persians remembered it as the throne of Jamshid. Each civilization fell in one sense and endured in another, proving that meaning outlasts matter and memory outlasts fire. The wider ruins echo the same truth. Easter Island teaches us that monuments can strain the very land that supports them, yet the Moai still stand, guardians of resilience. Machu Picchu teaches that concealment can preserve what conquest would have destroyed, its terraces waiting in silence until the world was ready to see them. Göbekli Tepe teaches that the impulse to build meaning predates farming, writing, or kingship, that from the beginning, humans sought to anchor themselves in eternity. These echoes fold back into Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis, showing that their stories are not anomalies, but archetypes. Together, they reveal that ruins are not just remnants. They are living dialogues between past and present. Each generation reinterprets them. For Cambodians, Angkor is national pride, its silhouette on their flag. For Greeks and Turks, Troy is both history and heritage, claimed by both as part of identity. For Iranians, Persepolis embodies grandeur and loss, pride and melancholy, a reminder of empire both celebrated and destroyed. These ruins live not only as stone, but as symbols, woven into the consciousness of nations. And beyond those nations, they live as global heritage, places where people from every corner of the world come to stand in silence and listen. What unites these places is their ability to outlive their own purposes. Angkor is no longer capital of god-kings, but it is sanctuary. Troy is no longer battleground of bronze-clad warriors, but it is poem. Persepolis is no longer ceremonial heart of empire, but it is legend. The transformation is the endurance. What they could not achieve in permanence of function, they achieved in permanence of meaning. That is why we continue to be drawn to them, not for what they were, but for what they have become. And so we return to the paradox that has followed us from the first steps into this journey. Fragility is not the opposite of endurance, but its condition. Without collapse, there is no memory. Without ruin, there is no myth. Without silence, there is no rediscovery. Angkor's jungle silence gave it mystery. Troy's fiery destruction gave it poetry. Persepolis' ashes gave it symbolism. Ruins endure precisely because they fall. This realization reframes how we see ourselves. We too are building monuments, stories, and systems we believe will last. Our cities of glass and steel, our networks of fiber and code, feel permanent. Yet one day they too will be ruins. Empty skyscrapers, silent servers, fragments of bridges and tunnels reclaimed by Earth. Future generations will walk among them, wondering who we were, why we built, why we fell. They will tell stories about us, some factual, some mythical, just as we do about Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis. And perhaps that is comfort rather than fear. For it means we will not vanish entirely. We will live on in the echoes our ruins create. To see ruins in this light is to see them not as failures, but as transformations. Angkor is not failure. It is faith enduring through jungle silence. Troy is not failure. It is memory enduring through poetry. Persepolis is not failure. It is identity enduring through myth. Each ruin is a conversation across centuries, proof that while civilizations cannot escape time, they can bend time into new forms of presence. As the closing arc begins, the three cities stand before us not as relics of the past, but as teachers. Angkor teaches humility before nature and the importance of belief. Troy teaches that stories are as enduring as stone, sometimes more so. Persepolis teaches that spectacle can collapse, but symbolism can survive. Together they teach that fragility and endurance are not enemies, but companions, bound together in the cycle of human civilization. If Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis are mirrors of the past, they are also windows into the future. To walk among their stones is to wonder not only what they once were, but what we will become. What ruins will we leave? What myths will rise from our ashes? What stories will future generations tell as they wander through the remnants of our age? Our cities stretch taller than Angkor's towers, wider than Troy's walls, grander than Persepolis' terraces. We have carved mountains to build highways, dammed rivers to generate power, filled skies with towers of glass and steel. We imagine these as permanent, as though concrete and steel are more eternal than limestone or sandstone. But history whispers otherwise. Every material crumbles, every system strains, every city is fragile. The question is not if we will leave ruins, but what kind. Will future travelers walk through hollow skyscrapers the way we walk through Angkor's towers? Will they find our monuments, bridges, museums, memorials, half buried, vines crawling over broken glass? Will they puzzle over our data centers and satellites, wondering what strange rituals required so many machines? Just as we speculate about moai, pyramids, or lotus towers, they will speculate about us. Our symbols will become their myths. And what myths might those be? Perhaps our skyscrapers will be remembered as towers built to touch the heavens, echoing Babel in modern form. Perhaps our vast stadiums will be imagined as temples of forgotten gods, where masses gathered to chant and cheer. Perhaps our highways will be seen as sacred paths, our satellites as wandering stars guided by human hands. Myths will fill the silence left by facts, because myth is how humans make sense of ruins. Just as the throne of Jamshid rose from Persepolis, so too will our monuments acquire names and meanings we never intended. But beyond myth lies memory. What will endure, in fact? Will our archives survive, etched in stone or preserved in code? Or will fragments remain, shards of ceramic, plastic, metal, telling partial stories the way pottery shards and arrowheads tell of Troy? Archaeologists of the future may marvel at our global reach, at traces of trade and communication spanning oceans, at evidence of beliefs both technological and spiritual. They may ask the same questions we ask of Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis. How did such a vast system rise? And how did it fall? The ruins we leave will reveal not only our power, but our values. Angkor reveals a civilization built on faith and water. Troy reveals a people defined by war and honor. Persepolis reveals an empire centered on unity and ceremony. What will our ruins reveal? That we worshipped progress, that we trusted machines more than gods, that we believed in connection across distance, yet often felt alone. Perhaps our ruins will speak of ambition, but also of imbalance, the same imbalance that undid civilizations before us. Climate change, war, overreach, these are not new threats. They are ancient patterns in modern clothing. Yet the ruins we leave may also carry hope. Just as monks kept Angkor alive, poets kept Troy alive, and Persians kept Persepolis alive, so too will someone, somewhere, keep our memory alive. Future storytellers will imagine our triumphs and tragedies, perhaps exaggerating, perhaps distorting, but always remembering. They will see in our ruins the same paradox we see in Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis. Fragility transformed into endurance. The ruins we leave will matter, not because they are perfect, but because they will invite questions. What did these people believe? How did they dream? What did they fear? Why did they fall? And in asking those questions, future generations will see themselves. That is the gift ruins give. They turn history into mirror. We look at Angkor and see our own dependence on environment. We look at Troy and see our own conflicts. We look at Persepolis and see our own spectacles of power. They are not just their ruins. They are ours, too, because they remind us of what it means to be human. So let us imagine a traveler, centuries from now, walking through the remains of a modern city. Perhaps the skyline is broken, windows shattered, vines crawling over concrete. Perhaps the monuments are cracked, inscriptions half vanished. Perhaps fragments of devices lie scattered, their purpose lost. The traveler pauses, as we pause at Angkor or Persepolis, and wonders, what story lies here? Who built this, and why? What dream burned in their hearts, and what silence followed? In that moment, we become myth. Our fragility becomes their endurance. This is not tragedy. It is continuity. The ruins we leave will join the chorus of Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis, adding another verse to humanity's hymn of ambition and memory. We cannot escape the cycle, but we can shape what we contribute to it. The meaning we carve now, into stories, into symbols, into acts of connection, will outlast the stones themselves. Angkor whispers of faith, Troy whispers of story, Persepolis whispers of identity. What will we whisper? That is the question left for us. The journey through Angkor, Troy, and Persepolis has been less about stones than about echoes. We have walked through jungle temples where roots twist like serpents around towers, across windswept plains where ashes still whisper of war, and up terraces where blackened columns rise against a desert sky. We have listened to myths and measured ruins, balanced legend against archaeology, and found that truth lives not in one or the other, but in the conversation between them. What endures is not certainty, but resonance. Angkor taught us that faith can raise empires and silence can swallow them. Its towers remind us that devotion and engineering can reshape nature, yet also that nature is patient, reclaiming even the grandest visions. Troy taught us that war consumes cities, but story can outlast fire. Its low walls remind us that myths preserve what ruins cannot, that imagination can carry memory across millennia. Persepolis taught us that spectacle can project power, but ruin can project meaning. Its reliefs remind us that symbols outlive ceremonies, that even destruction can become a kind of preservation. When placed side by side, the three cities do not simply tell their own stories, they tell ours. They remind us that civilizations are fragile, but that fragility is not failure. It is the condition of endurance. Without collapse, there is no memory. Without silence, no rediscovery. Without ruin, no story. The very act of falling ensures that something remains to be remembered. This is the paradox of ruins. They die to live again. And so the ruins are not warnings alone. They are promises. They promise that our own works, though they will crumble, will not vanish entirely. They will endure in fragments, in myths, in echoes carried by future generations. Our skyscrapers will be their Angkor, our wars their Troy, our ceremonies their Persepolis. We too will become part of the chorus of ruins, another verse in humanity's hymn of ambition and memory. The ruins tell us, you will not last, but you will not be forgotten. Perhaps that is why we are drawn to them. They console us as much as they humble us. They remind us that the meaning we carve into the world is not lost, even when the matter is. They show us that eternity was never in the stone, but in the story. And as long as stories are told, no city ever fully dies. So tonight, as we close this journey, let the stones speak once more. Let Angkor whisper of faith beneath jungle silence. Let Troy whisper of memory born in fire. Let Persepolis whisper of identity surviving through myth. Together, let them remind us that fragility and endurance walk hand in hand, that ruins are not ends but beginnings, that what we build is never only for ourselves, but for the future that will one day stand among our echoes. And with that, the ruins fall quiet, leaving only the sound of your own breath, steady against the vastness of time.